thank you so much for being here. I'm Sam, I'm the owner of Blue House Books. Sorry if you've heard that a million times already today. But thanks so much for being here. I do just want to point out, I want to give a big thank you to not Greta because she's sick, but Claire for stepping in for her. So this is not Greta Kelly. This is Claire Swinarski, who is one of our visiting authors today. She wrote The Funeral Ladies of Ellery County, and then we also have one of her YA books out there. So I just want to give a big props to her. I literally asked her as soon as she walked in to fill in, and so she's been great. So definitely go check out her book as well because we are big fans now. All right, so without further ado, I'll let you take it away.
Awesome, thank you, Sam. Like Sam said, I got handed this job 3 hours ago by Sam saying literally as we met, so how do you do with tasks just like being given to you last minute? I said, great. So here we are. I'm Claire Swinarski. I write middle grade and adult, but this panel is perfect because next year my first historical fiction middle grade comes out. About Paris during World War II. So I love historical fiction and I'm just super happy to be here with these amazing authors. So we can just start by having everyone kind of go down the line and just briefly introduce yourself and tell us about your most recent book.
Well, you're going to be bored because you're incredibly bored with me. My name is Alicia Salnicova Gilmore and I am a speculative historical fiction author. So I write historical fiction, but with a little dash of magic, either some horror, fantasy, ghosts, witches, that kind of thing. So my first book was a debut, The Witch and the Tsar. It came out in 2022. And now my second one that I'll be talking about today is The Haunting of Moscow House, and it is a historical gothic set in post-revolutionary Russia. And it is about two former aristocratic sisters who have to sort of race to uncover the secrets of their now haunted house and find out what happened to their family during the revolution.
I'm Julia Pine. I am also sort of, I guess I would say historical, speculative. Some of my books are historical, some are not, but my most recent one firmly is. It's called Madalena and the Dark, and it takes place in 1717 Venice. And it is about, it's inspired by the real life institution, sort of church, school / orphanage, where Antonio Vivaldi worked and taught adolescent girls how to play orchestral music. And so it takes two students of Vivaldi who are sort of competing to be in the main orchestra for this church school. And it's about sort of how far they will go to get what they want. And there's some sort of creepy canal creatures involved too. So also a dash of fantasy.
Hi, I'm Ron Balson, and my book, A Place to Hide, is about the Netherlands and principally Amsterdam during World War II, during that period of time. And it's told by two Americans who worked for the U.S. consulate in Amsterdam, and from what they observed happening with the country before and after the Nazis attacked and took over the country and tried to put in their racial laws and things, and then how they, when the consulate closed, how they wound up joining some of the underground groups that save people. So that's the place to hide.
Awesome. So your books all take place across really different times, right? We're in the 1700s, and we're in Russia, we're in World War II, we're just all over the place. And with historical fiction, there's just so many time periods that you could write about. I'd love to hear from each of you why you chose your specific time period, like what really drew you to that time and that place. And we don't have to go in order either, we can just kind of popcorn, whoever feels like talking.
Yeah, I'll answer. So I initially, I had, in sort of thinking about what I wanted to write about, trying to think of like what would be a good place for a novel, what would give me inspiration, I came across or sort of recollected from my childhood that Vivaldi had taught these young girls at a time when women really were not allowed to play instrumental music, and they had to play, this orchestra played with like a screen in front of them so no one could see them, and it was in Venice, and it was in the 1700s, and it felt like, okay, the vibes are really good, there's a lot here, it's really rich. And the more that I researched Venice in the sort of early to mid 1700s, the more I realized how many parallels it felt like there were to America in the 2020s, because Venice at that point was sort of at the end of empire. Like they had, you could say Venice peaked sort of during the Renaissance in like the 1500s, and then sort of began this very slow downfall that would sort of end with Napoleon invading about 50 years after my book takes place. But there was massive inequality sort of with the very wealthy and the decisions they made and the things they had access to, and the very poor and what they did, and there was sort of political machinations, and it just felt like more and more, there were more and more parallels that I could see between what was happening in Venice at that time and what it felt like I was living through. And so I think what began initially as a, like, this has good vibes, I like the aesthetic, this is interesting because of, you know, this one very particular spot and particular historical situation, very quickly became a book about sort of wealth inequality and about societal pressures in a way that I had not expected when I first came across the setting.
Alicia or Ron?
All right.
Yeah, you can go.
Place to Hide is my 9th book, and almost all of them are written about the period during World War II. It's just a period that the more I research, the more that it seems like there are more stories to write. Things come out, and I meet people. Goodness, I wrote Once We Were Brothers because I spent a whole lot of time working on a law case in Poland, and then while I was touring for Once We Were Brothers, I meet this incredible woman who lived in Lincolnwood, and she told me about the story where she was on a train headed to one of the camps, and this woman had twins, and when they pulled over to a side, let another train pass, she threw her children, her babies, out the window into the, because she knew they would die when they got to Auschwitz. And that was so moving to me that I had to write a story, and that became Carolina's Twins. So it just seems like every time something in my research or people tell me a story, that's what sets me off to write a story. And almost all of them are World War II.
Yeah, I agree. It happens to me like that too, where the time period is really chosen by characters or a historical situation that I come across. So in this case, for The Haunting of Moscow House, I knew my next book, I wanted it to be about the revolution, the Russian Revolution. I had always had an interest in it. I knew I wanted to write about it, but I also knew I didn't want to write about the same thing that is usually written, and usually what is written is the last Tsar's family. And so I had read a lot of books about that and just wanted something new. And so I came across this real family that were former aristocrats that were living in their old ancestral house alongside their class enemies, Soviet men. And that situation just sparked my interest because, first of all, how can you live in your past? So, you know, this house that they lived in belonged to their family for centuries, generations, and so it still held a lot of their kind of glorious past, a lot of the very fancy, famous artworks and furniture and all that stuff, and that stayed. But then they were living next to kind of their present, their Soviet present. And the Soviet men called them former people because they were essentially non-people in the Soviet society. And so that just really sparked my imagination because it got me really excited about learning a little corner of history that I didn't know about. And speaking of that, a lot of these former people actually worked for an American organization that was really in Russia in 1921. to help with the famine as a result of the revolution and all the civil upheaval. And it was very fascinating to me how that was a second kind of aspect of tension in my novel, where a lot of these Russian people that worked for an American organization got in a lot of trouble with their government because they worked for Americans. So that kind of added to the tension that my characters were feeling. It wasn't only the supernatural aspects of their house coming back to life, it was also kind of the very real danger that they were in. So that for me was really interesting. And I'll just add quickly one more thing, because you mentioned the pandemic. And when I was working on this, it was very much, I was kind of having this very difficult time because my grandmother just passed away. She was in Russia, so I couldn't visit her. And I was just having a lot of thoughts about kind of the family that had passed on. And that's what my sisters struggle with in my book. They struggle with the family that had passed on, and they don't know how to move on from kind of their past. And so that's kind of what my book ended up being.
So let's talk about research, because when you're writing a historical fiction book, obviously research plays a huge component if you want to have some accuracy, which I know we all value. For my historical fiction middle grade that comes out next year, a problem I kind of ran into was like, there's so many books about France in World War II. You could read nothing but that for 5 years and you wouldn't be done. And at some point I was like, I have to start writing. Like, I can't just keep reading books. So for you, like, are you a writer who needs to research ahead of time and do a ton of work on the front end, or do you more like research on the fly as you write? When you come into a problem, are you like, oh, what food would they have eaten? Or do you like to do more of that at the beginning?
So for me, that has come from the publishing schedule. So a lot of times for my editor, I have to prepare a proposal. That's how I sell a book. So that involves a pitch as well as a synopsis, which is kind of a summary of the book, as well as the first kind of few chapters. So I'll usually do a couple of key sources that I identify, and then I kind of write all this material. And then I usually do about like half the research, I would say, and on the front end before I start to write kind of the most important, 5 to 8 books, I don't know what it is, online research. And then usually I'll pause, I'll write the draft, and then I'll kind of determine, do I need the second half of my research? What do I need that I didn't identify before? And so it's kind of just an evolving process for me with research, but I've started to like limit myself because I just don't have time. Yeah. So usually I will just have a deadline for myself. Okay, here I'm starting my first draft. I am just not going to do any more, even though I'm interested in everything and want to just write, read like the whole time. I just want to read and learn more, but I just can't. So I just kind of limit myself and say, okay, I'm going to start it now.
Sure. I would say the first 3 months of when I take on to write a book and I figure out what I'm going to write about, the first 3 months is spent doing nothing but research. Just plain research. Don't write anything yet. Don't start a character yet, because sure enough, if you start writing and you get a plot going and you like the plot, you're going to find out that that's not what research upholds. And it's so the first thing I do is research, and I do it in a funny way because you go online. There's so many sources online that you can find, and I'll read some, and I'll take that snatch of material and I put it here, and then I'll read something else. And I say, that's an interesting part, and I'll grab that and I'll put it here. So at the end of maybe 3-4 months, I've got pages and pages and pages of snippets that I know I want to have in the book somewhere. I got to work them in. But really, with research, when you do historical fiction, it's so important, because sure enough, if you're careless about it, someone will come along and say, well, he said this, and that's not what happened at all.
They certainly will. I feel like I was almost lucky in that the time period I chose to write about, there isn't a ton of information out there. Like, there is not much written. There's really nothing contemporary, like that Vivaldi's contemporaries wrote about him, and there's not a lot that comes from that particular world where I was writing, what you get is like 100 years later, people romanticizing it, or a letter from a tourist writing home about the time they spent in Venice, which sometimes would contradict each other. So there is, it's a great place to write fiction because if there's no sort of established memory of this place, that you can choose the one that best suits the story you're trying to tell. So a lot of the things historically that I was reading were sort of secondary sources that were then disputed, or so it was an interesting time. So there wasn't a ton of information, and the information that was there wasn't necessarily verified, which was sort of a fun way to explore. And it also meant that I wanted to make sure that the things I could verify were like really airtight. So I did a lot of research about the city itself, and Venice is a great place to sort of set historical fiction in because it still looks a lot like it would have looked in 1700. There's certain buildings have been torn down and rebuilt, but there's still cars. Like it's a much more, like the city, if you go there, it's very easy to imagine yourself there. The places still exist that they would have gone to. So I verified all those places. And then for this particular book too, so much of it is about music. And so I did a lot of music research, so I read a lot of musicology and music theory, and listened to a lot of Vivaldi. But then I also, at the same time, was listening to the contemporary or more contemporary music that I felt like was going to keep the book from sort of bogging down. So if I were to describe the book, I'd say it's a mix of Olivia Rodrigo's Sour album and the Killers' Hot Fuss, and then Vivaldi's entire catalog. It was such a but I watched a lot. So I watched a lot of YouTube of sort of master musicians teaching master classes.
I did that. I took master violin lessons.
Really?
I wrote a book called The Girl from Berlin about a girl who was a violinist.
Yes, you have to get yourself in there, yeah.
You do, and I took master violin classes.
I did not go that far. Shame on me. No, I watched a lot of YouTube master classes. This was a pandemic project, like an early 2020 project. So my resources were a little more limited. But there is, one of the nice things about sort of the world we live in these days is that you can access experts and put the time in to do that side of the research as well as the historical stuff. The music research was great. I don't know if you had the same experience, or it was just really...
How am I going to talk about this girl and her fingering techniques and what she was doing without having Yasha Heifetz teach them to me?
That's commitment. I love that.
But you can't write though, because then anybody who plays I had readers, I don't know if you did too, violinists read through just specifically for is that description accurate? Yeah.
One of my all-time favorite authors is Anthony Doerr, who wrote All the Light We Cannot See, and he has a short story collection called The Shell Collector, and he had some marine biologist write to him because he had a shell on a beach where it would not be in South America, and he was like, oh my gosh. So it's you're never gonna get quite to that level. He was saying at some point you have to loosen the grip. But he did look up he looked in an old farmer's almanac for the weather of the day that Paris was invaded because it was raining. So it's the amount of research you can incorporate can be just wild. Yeah. So what was one of the most surprising facts you guys learned during your research? Ron, you've been researching World War II for so long. Can you still be surprised?
Oh yeah. There's so much has happened. Now, right now, this book I have out now, it's about the Netherlands. The Netherlands is a total surprise to me, and especially what happened. Netherlands. They have no interest in getting into World War II. They don't want anything to do with it. They didn't have anything to do with World War I. They were totally neutral, stayed out of the whole thing. No one bothered them, and that's exactly what they intended to do. In World War II, they even had an agreement with Nazi Germany that they would be neutral and they would be honored. And that lasted all of about 6 months. And so, everything is so surprising when you do historical fiction.
What about you two? Anything surprising in your research?
Man, I feel just the time was so interesting and the logistics of the situation. So in Venice was one of the few republics in Europe, maybe only at the time. And so they had sort of a, I hate to say like a welfare, it wasn't really a welfare state, but like beginning in like the 1200s, the Republic sort of sponsored these church orphanages that turned into these, by 1720, had turned into these music institutions, and so the best musicians in the world were these orphan girls playing instrumental music when no women were allowed to play instrumental music in Europe. They played behind a screen. There was like sort of like a fireplace grate so that people couldn't see them and get, I guess, like titillated or whatever. But it was, yeah, so it was these, but there were four of these ospedales that would compete against each other to have like the best church music, basically. And Vivaldi, where he comes in, is he started as a violin teacher and became the maestro de concerti, like the head of the orchestra at the Ospedale della Pietà. And he was sort of the governor, the people in charge didn't really like him, and he had some issues with the Republic, so he was sort of in and out there. But like there was this whole world of these like orphaned, like the Pietà specifically was founded for the daughters of courtesans or the children of courtesans, and you would just drop your kid off like on the steps basically, and they would take them in, and if they were musically talented, they'd get started at like 6 years old on music, and if not, they would like clean the floor and do the sewing, you know? But it was this whole ecosystem that is so foreign to us today. That was, again, it was like state sponsored, but also it was a lot of rich people sort of donating by 1700. But yeah, so I think that whole thing to me was surprising. And then the other thing too that like I really got stuck on is that it wasn't like you could train in these places and then be like, I'm gonna go be an opera singer in Milan. Like if you left and you wanted to get married, well, you really could only leave by getting married or joining a nunnery because you were like a woman with no money. And if you wanted to leave and go out into the world, you weren't allowed to play music. So they couldn't be just like using this as a training ground for your next like step up or taking the techniques or anything. And so I was fascinated by, and that's sort of what the book is about, is like these very stark choices that these women have of, you know, the thing that I've been trained to do and love to do, and like, you know, playing music, or a life outside of this very strict church orphanage situation. I mean, I could talk about this for like 100 years, but anyway, that's the Pietà, the Ospedale system is just really fascinating, and we don't have anything like it today, really, so a lot of people don't know about it. Alicia?
Yeah, I mean, similar to you, like, I just get interested by parts of history that I did not read in school, or I did not study in school, I haven't heard about, and so with this project, I was just so surprised about the plight of the former people, as they're called. It really just, moved me to such an extent, because you just had these people that were essentially disinherited during this massive social and political upheaval. And you know, a lot of them had to leave the country, a lot of them were exiled, a lot of them were killed, both during the revolution and after as well, because some of them survived only to be sent to Stalin's camps during the purges in the 1930s. So you know, and that's what really inspired this story, is this is a piece of history that we don't know. And it's interesting because when my family, who is Russian, talk about the revolution, you know, they mostly talk about the last Tsar, they obviously talked about Lenin back in the day, but I never heard about these people. In fact, I had never even heard about some of these families. And so learning about them and learning about kind of their sufferings after the revolution, how much they lost, and then just seeing their successes as well. You know, some of them became actors, some of them became writers, some of them moved to, you know, to Paris, to New York, and continued their careers and lives there. So it was just very fascinating to learn about them. And then the other piece of the history that was even more, I think, shocking to me was the existence of this American organization. So it's called the American Relief Administration, and I had not heard about it at all. And it was really interesting because the people in my life who are Russian had never heard about it, and then Americans had never heard about it. Even I just talked to a friend of mine who actually worked in Russia for 10 years, and she's American. She had never heard about it. And so, and she was doing the type of work that they did, relief work in Moscow. And so that just goes to show that it's the victors that write the history, and that there's some history that's hidden, that's just buried. And so this organization, I felt like, to me, was just such a brilliant example of international humanitarianism at a time similar to now that was very difficult politically and socially. And so I was just very inspired by some of their stories as well, and helping the Russian people during a very, very difficult, political and social situation. So I was just very fascinated.
Julia and Alicia, you both have fantastical elements in your books, right? A little bit of magic, a little bit of ghost situations going on. Why did you decide to add that layer? Did you look to any folklore or superstition as inspiration, or did it come from somewhere else? Why did you decide to add that magical element?
Sure, go for it.
Well, for me, it started with the family that I talked about. That's based on the family in my book. It was a family that really did, I think I already mentioned this, but I'll say it again. It was a family that really did live in their ancestral house after the revolution. Unlike many, they decided to stay in Russia to see if things would get better. And so I specifically read about these two sisters belonging to this family, and they were described as these astral spirits that would just kind of float about the house. They would, only leave the house to go to church and pray. They pretended their dead husbands were actually alive. And so that to me, and they lived in the attic of their old house. So that to me was just fodder for a Gothic historical novel. And then this house was just described as a stately mansion, becoming, going into disrepair, crumbling, and then just all of their stuff just, lying there. I'm talking about Titians and Van Dycks and all these famous artists. Their paintings are just kind of in their attic or set against the walls, becoming corroded with time. And that whole just situation was just so romantic to me that it screamed Gothic horror. And so that's kind of where that came from. And then from there, I did a lot of research into Gothic stories. So whether it's classical Gothic you may have heard of, like The Haunting of Hill House or Rebecca, or more contemporary Gothic novels, The Hacienda or Mexican Gothic. But I did a lot of Russian Gothic research. So I studied a lot of Nikolai Gogol, who's kind of the founder of the Russian Gothic genre. And you'll see kind of a lot of references to him. I definitely wanted this to be a classic Gothic novel. And just some folklore research as well, because this was such a novel about the home and about ancestors and the past. And so I did do a lot of kind of research into Slavic belief, especially pagan belief, into the home, the spirits of the home, the ancestors of the home. So that was really fascinating too. Julia?
Yeah, for me, it actually sort of goes back to what Ron said about how you do all this, you sort of come up with an idea and you do all this research, and if you get started before you've done the research, you might find you've written yourself into a situation that's just historically totally inaccurate or anachronistic. And so it wasn't quite that, but it was close because I knew I wanted to write about these girls. But when I was reading about them, their lives were so confined. They didn't go anywhere. They just prayed all day. It sounded, from a modern perspective, pretty miserable, but I think a lot better than it would be had they not been in this institution. But I realized that if I wanted to sort of get outside of that world, I either was going to need a character who was totally outside the box that I was not as interested in including, or have some way for them to get out. And so it sort of began with this idea of a way for them to get out. And while I was doing this research, thinking about how I was going to get them sort of out of these four walls so that a book could be interesting, I came across, there's a tradition in Venice that goes back again to the Middle Ages called the Marriage of the Sea, where the Doge, who was the head of state in Venice, every year would row out to, so Venice is on this lagoon, and so you have, if you think of the Venice Film Festival takes place on the Lido, which is against the ocean, the Adriatic Sea, and then there's the lagoon in between. So the Doge would row out from Venice to where the ocean sort of meets the lagoon, and so it would be, it'd be a huge procession, very fancy, very they did a lot of, again, about spending the profligacy and spending a lot of money on things that ultimately led to their downfall. But this was a tradition where they would go, they would take a wedding ring, and they would sort of have this Latin ceremony that effectively was like Venice, the city is now married to the sea. And so it was all very symbolic, but then to my mind I was like, well, what if it's not symbolic? Like, what are they committing to there? And that sort of led into this idea of, I was already writing about these girls who were very ambitious and sort of boxed into a corner, and I thought about like, well, what would you sacrifice? What are you giving away to? And so the book became sort of a story of like, what would you give up to get what you want when you're in this, and who are you giving it to, and what does that mean? Sort of based on the marriage of the sea, but it really initially came from that constraint of like, if this is going to be straight historical, I'm going to be writing a book about girls who only talk to each other like 20 minutes a day because they're either praying or playing music for us.
That is
Well, wait a minute, let me comment, because you asked them because they have these fantasy characters, witches and ghosts and things like that. I do the same thing. Okay, so in my present book, A Place to Hide, the story is told by Teddy, who's the son of a well-to-do family in Washington, who goes to Amsterdam to work in the consulate, and Julia, who finds herself in Amsterdam and gets a job with the consulate. And they are the ones who pull out the story. They're the ones that tell you what actually happened in Amsterdam during that period of time. In other words, you can identify with Teddy and you can identify with Julia because they're like you in many ways, and they will draw you into the story. So and then they will tell you what happened. Why does it matter whether you have a ghost or I have a made-up character? They're both there to tell the story.
Ron, I have a question about World War II, because people love World War II. They love it. Like, when you go to Barnes & Noble, I know every Barnes & Noble is different now, but the one by my house, Brookfield Square Mall, Brookfield represent, they have a history section, and World War II has its own shelf. It's like all of the history, and then World War II history. Like, people love it so much, and I do too. We just watched Masters of the Air, loved it. I have my middle grade book coming out next year. What is it about World War II, do you think? Like, why does it draw so many people in?
I wish I had an answer. I can tell you that because it was a world war, and it just involved so many countries in such a deep way. Hitler was such a powerful, wicked character, and there was a good chance that he would indeed take over not just Europe, because he did, but the whole world. And it was so wicked, it was so terrible, and yet it was so successful, at least until for the first 4 or 5 years of it. From 38 to 44, and the stories in each of the country, how they were conquered, how their society was eradicated, all of that is just so powerful that we've never had anything like that in history. So that, I think it probably speaks to it.
No, I think that makes sense. And what you were saying earlier is there's just so many stories. You could be in the Netherlands, you could be in Canada. Like, there's just so many stories that you could emphasize.
I wonder too, and this is as someone who, I have not done deep research into World War II, but I have my own family stories and have read enough. But it does seem like in that particular situation, there's the clear good guys and the clear bad guys. And especially in America, we sort of have been raised on sort of all of these comic books based on superheroes fighting Nazis, and I think it's not a lot of other wars or historical time
Literally
periods.
Indiana Jones, Superman.
But there's nuance, and I'm sure that there is nuance too for the average German family. But it is we can very clearly be like good guys, bad guys in a way that about a lot of other international conflicts, it's harder to do that. I don't know. I just wonder. This is just off the cuff. I just wonder if that is something, though.
Yeah, and we talked about earlier, Ron and I talked about why I don't write World War II, which is actually telling. And you mentioned family stories, and I feel like my husband sometimes asks me, he's like, well, it's a really recent conflict. I mean, it's, a lot of people know about it, of course, but a lot of people are intrigued by it too. And for me, it's like both my grandfathers fought in World War II. Like I think all of my grandmothers, their villages were taken over by Nazis. Their friends were killed. Their Jewish friends taken to camps. And so I grew up with those stories. And for me, when I think about World War II stories, I remember my grandparents, and I just get very sad. And so I feel like I haven't gone there because I think it would just be such a difficult emotional experience for me, which means that I should probably go there at some point.
I kind of feel that like I am going there, but my husband is from Poland, and we go there every summer. We were talking about, and talking to his grandparents is just wild. His grandpa just telling me like, oh yeah, well, and then I was walking in and I saw my neighbor's dead body in a ditch, and I'm just like, what? Like, I'm in the 90s in Wisconsin, like we had very different childhoods. It's just, I do think that can either attract people to it or scare people. It's kind of depending on your personality.
You can't go to Poland now, even now, and not travel around like in Warsaw, Krakow, and not see remnants of World War II.
Yeah.
The statues, the monuments, the entrance to the Warsaw Ghetto. You can't. I mean, that's what motivated me to write my first book, Once We Were Brothers. The fact that I had a law case that took me to Poland, and one day I was going to a deposition. I had the questions in my mind. What am I going to ask this guy at the deposition? I passed by this brick wall. In the brick wall, and this is like just a few years ago. Here are these holes in the wall and a plaque that says, "Here in 1942, the Nazis executed X amount of people." And it is so
everywhere.
Powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. So if anyone in the audience is interested in writing historical fiction, if we've got some aspiring authors in here, do you have any advice you would give someone who's like interested in writing historical fiction but maybe feeling a little intimidated by the process?
I think so. Did we talk about this earlier with research? I think none of us actually touched on it of like, do you research before or during? And I think
I feel like you all said both.
Yeah, I think the answer is both. The key thing that you have to do, or that I have found I have to do, is I do all my research and it's in my brain and it's there and I've spent my months. And then when I start writing, if I get to a point where I need to know like what kind of shoe that person is wearing, you write TK and then you move on and you don't stop and look. You don't take your writing time to go do research. You sort of flag it and you say, I'm going to come back and find out what food they would eat in this place, or I'm going to find out who was the prince of whatever at this time. Because if every time you get to a point where you're like, I need this historical information, you stop writing, you'll never get a book written. You have to just like power through the draft and then go back. And I think early on I fell into the trap of, I have 2 hours to write, I'll spend 15 minutes writing and then an hour 45 looking for this one tiny little tidbit. Like you have to keep that time sacred and separate.
I'm the opposite.
Really?
More.
Never mind.
If there's something I gotta know, I gotta know.
Tiebreaker.
So that writing day might be 7 or 8 hours long because I've gotta know it, and it might take me on somewhere else.
I have to say that I've realized Julia's approach because so I came into historical fiction from fantasy. So it was historical fantasy, but still it was a lot more fantasy than my second book, which is mostly historical fiction. And actually first I'm going to back up. When I first started writing, I wrote a fantasy novel, purely fantasy contemporary novel. It didn't go anywhere. But the fact was that I knew I was interested in historical fiction because I always read historical fiction. But I was afraid. So I wrote this fantasy, and it didn't go anywhere, as I said. And I realized to myself, you know what, like I really need to work on what I really enjoy and not be afraid of it, which was one of my husband's advice to me at the time. And I think that worked really well because when I started, I had no idea what I was doing. I was researching everything all the time. And you kind of learn your way through it. So I would say my biggest advice is just to start. If you're interested in historical fiction, don't be afraid of it. Don't be afraid of the time period, you know, like I was with World War II. Don't be afraid of the amount of research. You'll kind of, you'll learn what you need as you go, is what I've learned. And I've also learned to trust the process. So that part of it is, okay, I don't know everything right now. I'm going to make a note in my draft and then I'll come back to it. Or, okay, this isn't quite perfect right now, like the way it's worded, I don't like it. But you know what? It's good for now. I know I'm going to have many more times on this draft, and I'm just going to trust myself to go back to it. And I feel like this has been a much more pleasant process for me in general. So I would say my biggest advice, just to begin and do it and find what works for you. As you can see, even from all three of us, we have different approaches. And I think as you write, you learn your own approach to, whether it's historical fiction or not, but especially with historical fiction. You learn what works best for you, what you like, what you enjoy, what time period you enjoy, what you're interested in. That's the other thing. You have to pick a time period you're really interested in.
Yeah, you have to be like obsessively interested
Yeah.
and want to know everything. 'Cause, like,
Yeah.
you'll have to know everything.
You have to.
Yeah, but how much time is spent editing and correcting them, right? How many edits do you need to correct those things that, oh, I didn't say that well, or it wasn't accurate? I mean, I needed to say.
Oh, I think you can't write. I feel like you have to write the whole thing in order to know what you even need in the beginning. Like to go, especially on a line level, to go back and edit and sort of polish and perfect a first few chapters, only to then get to the end of the book and realize that like this isn't what needs to be there. It's heartbreaking to get rid of it. So I've learned to like just keep pushing through and then save. Like you have to like create the raw material and then you can like mold it sort of.
Yeah, that's what I learned too.
I think I'm throwing myself in here, even though I'm the moderator. I think my only advice for historical fiction would be, unless you're writing Wisconsin historical fiction, which there's not enough of, and we have a fascinating history, so but I would say if there's just, it's so important to be able to try and go to the place, and it can't always happen, and that doesn't mean that your book's not going to be amazing, but I just think it really helps to be there, I went on 2 different research trips to Paris for this book, and it's kind of like Ron was saying in Poland, just to be able to be there walking the streets, I think was so helpful, and obviously you've been to Russia, and you said you did get to go to Venice, so
yeah, it adds like that extra layer of,
So most writers are also readers. I'm assuming you all are. When you're reading a book, like you're just picking your Saturday night read, do you like to read in the time period you write in, or are you kind of sick of being there and you're like, I need to read mystery, or I don't know. What do you like to read?
I mean, this is while working on this book, I sort of counted reading any historical fiction that was set around the time I was writing as research, and I wanted to do that all before I started so that it wasn't, like I would never concurrently be writing something and reading something set in the same place at the same time, but especially because the time period that I was writing about, again, like there wasn't a lot of concrete sort of like historical fact, and so I did read a decent amount of like historical fiction set in and around Venice in the 1700s. But then while writing, I feel like I want to read something as different as possible to not let it like sort of color what I'm doing. Like all the prep work is done of the books that I want to sort of be in conversation with, or the voice that I want to be influenced by, or like what it is that I'm trying to do here. And then during it, I want to be just like totally different so I can have what I'm doing and not have it bleed.
I tend to read in my area. I tend to read historical fiction. Because by Woke or someone, and how did they do it? You know, how did they approach this subject? Was it good? Did I like it? Could I do it? You know.
Yeah, I have some of that. I feel like when I'm researching, I'll read a lot of titles where they're similar to my time frame, or have some of the same elements. So I read a lot of, Gothic literature, a lot of literature about haunted houses, both contemporary and classic. And yeah, I mean, it's helpful to me just because I see what's on the market, I see what's selling, especially the contemporary stuff, obviously. And I see, how they're doing it, what I'm interested in, the different elements that they're including in their books. But then I get to the writing phase and I'm just burnt out. So right now I should be reading some Gothic literature that I really want to read, but I'm reading romance and thrillers, which is not my area at all. And I just keep reading these books that are just not relevant to me.
You never know what's going to be relevant though and what's going to feed you. I did not think, again, I had never read romance really, and then early pandemic, I was like, I need something that is just going to make me feel good. And I feel like I learned so much to translate into literary fiction from those genres. So you're still working.
Yeah, no, I mean, I do agree. I think I was reading Emily Henry when I was working on the romances in my Gothic book, and I felt like she helped me. She helped me realize a lot of things about romance that maybe I wasn't doing before. So that was definitely a good example of okay, I'm learning, but I also love audiobooks so much, and so I just listen to a lot of audiobooks, and I just always have them on. I always have my headphones on, I feel whenever I do anything around the house or anything else. So I'm just constantly absorbing stories in general, because I love stories, that's why we're here.
That is why we are here. So speaking of loving stories, just as we kind of wrap up, I'd love to just hear from each of you what is coming up next for you, if you want to share, and where can people find you online after today?
I guess I'll
We
go
can
first.
just go down the line.
So my next book is a historical Gothic as well, and I'm not allowed to talk about it yet, but I can't wait to talk more about it. I'm really excited about it. And you can find me online at Alicia Author, and I spell my name, O-L-E-S as in Sam, Y-A. And I'm mostly on Instagram these days, but I'm also on Twitter and Facebook.
I'm also not sure if I'm actually allowed to talk about my next book. I'm not asked. But the next...
They're not here. I don't see your
my next project takes place in the world of early aughts reality TV. So big departure, and should come out 2025 or 6. I don't know. Early book is written, but the sort of process is still in the works.
That's kind of historical at this point.
I know, but it's a lot easier to put yourself in the mind of 2002 than 1700. But yeah, I'm also mostly on Instagram. I'm occasionally on Twitter, but not so much anymore. Sad.
It is
Sad.
Yeah.
It's been sort of but yeah.
When I was writing about the Netherlands and whatnot during that period of time, and I tended to see a lot that talked to me about Hungary and Budapest and what happened in that country. And while you might not be so sympathetic to start out because they were allies of Hitler, they were part of the Axis, but they also had 1 million Jews, 1 million in that country. And what they did, and then what Hitler finally decided to do and everything. It's an unbelievable story, and so that was my next book, and I'm about 2/3, say, maybe half to 2/3 done with that. It'll probably be out sometime in 2025 in the fall. But I was able, I think, to take some of the main characters from A Place to Hide and move them into this, so it's kind of a sequel. So if you like Julia, she's back, she's powerful.
And like I said, my name is Claire Swinarski. My middle grade book, Each and Every Spark, comes out next November, and I'm just at claireswinarski.com. All my little linky links are there. So yeah, thank you all so much. These lovely authors will all be out at their tables, so if you have any questions for them or want to check out their books and read the backs and have them sign one or take a picture, they, I'm sure, would just be thrilled. So thank you so much for coming today.